Hello, and welcome to U.S. History 2202. This is Professor James Cement. This is the lecture 3 for week 6 on imperialism in World War I. This lecture will focus on World War I. What you just heard was a recording of a George M. Cohan song called Over There, composed in 1917. George M. Cohan was an extremely popular American composer of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He was an Irish-American composer, and he kind of specialized in this highly patriotic music. Some of his other tunes that you may have heard of, Grand Old Flag, Yankee Doodle Boy. And George M. Cohan was part of this group of composers known as Tin Pan Alley, a group of songwriters based in New York City, in a group of buildings in New York City in the heart of Midtown. And they were the heart of American popular music scene then. The term Tin Pan Alley, of course, comes from the fact that in many of their offices in these high-rise buildings in Midtown, you could hear them banging away on their cheap pianos, and many people felt it sounded like the banging of tin pans against each other, so that was the term given to this area of musical composition in New York. Now, this particular piece was extremely popular. It was the number one hit of World War I. It sold over 2 million copies of sheet music, the most popular way to obtain recordings of those, or music in that day, and then you would go home and play it yourself or sing it yourself or in a group. 2 million downloads on iTunes today would even be a major best-selling song, so you can understand how popular it was at the time. And of course, it reflected American patriotism as we entered World War I in 1917. So as we begin our discussion of World War I and America's participation in it, some of the questions we're going to be looking at are what were American attitudes about Europe before World War I. We actually looked at that in previous lectures this week. What were some of the factors leading to the start of World War I? What was the nature of warfare in World War I? Factors leading to U.S. entry into the war. Why was America's entry into the war critical for its outcome? What role did we play? We're going to take a look at the home front, what life was like here for good and bad. What did Wilson hope to achieve internationally after World War One, and why was he thwarted in his ambitions? Specifically around the League of Nations, what were the arguments both for and against American participation, American membership in the League of Nations? And what was the post-World War I Red Scare about? And how did the war lead to the isolationist politics of the 1920s and 1930s, which delayed American entry into World War II? So we'll get to all of those questions in a moment. But before we do that, I just want to be clear about which war we're talking about here. And I don't want to insult anybody's intelligence, but a lot of people sometimes confuse what happened in World War I and World War II. It is the war on the left. It is the war of trench warfare. It is a war of when new weapons like the machine gun and poison gas and the airplane were introduced. It involved world leaders such as Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States on the left, and of course Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. It is not World War II, something we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks. So let's begin with what caused World War I in Europe. And in examining the causes of World War I, we should keep something in mind. In studying the history of human events, all the great events in world history, and trying to examine, what set them off, what caused them, I would argue that there is probably no great event, world-shaking event in human history, when examining the causes of it, that is more complicated, more complex than the factors that led up to World War I. But we can kind of narrow them down into a couple of basic categories. And the reason why I say it's so complicated is you can see here sort of a map of the different alliances of the different powers, and we'll get to that in a moment. But it's an incredibly complicated set of events that led up to the actual outbreak of World War I in August of 1914. But again, we can narrow them down to a couple of basic. And by the way, if you're interested in learning more about the causes of World War I do spend quite a bit of time on the subject in World History 1102, and other professors I'm sure do as well. So if you are interested in sort of looking at European history and what led up to World War I, and why World War I is so critical to the history of the world, you can learn more about that in World History 1102. But for now, as I said, we're going to narrow it down to a few basic ideas or a few basic forces that led to the outbreak of World War I. One, of course, was nationalism. Now, what is nationalism? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? What is it about? What is it bad about it? And nationalism kind of overlaps with the idea of patriotism, love of country. But what it really is it's the idea that a cultural group defined by perhaps religion or cultural customs or a common history or a common language, that these people deserve to have a nation state of their own. And that this nation state should have, a government of its own, should be separate from other nations of the world and should compete with those other nations of the world. So this idea that a given cultural group should have a nation state of their own is what nationalism is really about. And in examining nationalism in Europe in the 19th century, in the decades and decades leading up to World War I, there are kind of two kinds of nationalism we should look at. One was the nationalism that was arising in Eastern Europe and to some extent Southeastern Europe and the Balkans and so forth. A number of those two parts of Europe were largely absorbed into two great empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, three great empires I should say, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. And within these great empires, there were dozens and dozens of different nationalities. They didn't have nation states of their own, and they wanted nation states of their own. They felt that this was this was their destiny to have a nation state of their own, and they wanted to be independent of these empires. These empires felt that they could grant a certain degree of autonomy to these nations, these nationalities, so they could have control maybe over local customs, local issues like schools and teaching and that sort of thing. But the idea was that they belong to this greater empire, which rules over them in a sort of benevolent way that protects them on the world stage. But it wasn't satisfactory to many nationalities that existed in Eastern Europe during this time. And many of them wanted to kind of carve out nation states of their own. Perhaps the most significant of these national groups, and the one that was sort of most active in pursuing that and had been somewhat successful in achieving a certain degree of independence, was the nation state of Serbia, which had emerged in the late 19th century, carving itself out of sections of the Ottoman Empire. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Serbia in terms of the events that immediately lead up to World War I. The other major nationality, or nationalism, I should say, of the 19th century, the rising nationalism of the 19th century, was that of Germany. Now, Germany came from a different, exactly sort of the opposite issue. In terms of Germany, you had until the middle part of the 19th century, there was no Germany. Germany was a collection of principalities, little kingdoms, little monarchies, all kinds of dozens and dozens of little tiny states. And some large ones, primarily Prussia, which was in what is today Eastern Germany. And over the course of the middle decades of the 19th century, there was a movement among the German people to kind of create a nation state for the German people collectively, because all these different principalities, all these different little sovereign states clustered in Central Europe, I mean, they did share certain cultural customs. They certainly shared a language. They shared an idea that they had a common history, a common heritage, a common origin story, and that it was felt that the German people, the German-speaking peoples of Central Europe, should unite into one nation state that would represent Germany on the international stage. And so in 1870, in the 1870s, particularly in 1871 to be specific, a number of these German nationalities, under the leadership of Prussia, the biggest of them all, united to form the first German Empire in Central Europe, or the first Reich, or Reich, as it is called in German. Actually, I should say it was the Second Reich. The First Reich was a medieval empire, but we don't need to go into that. And of course, the Third Reich, of course, is famous because it was the creation of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis in the 1930s and 40s. But again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple of weeks, and you can examine that more in World History 102. So these two forces, these two kinds of nationalisms, the nationalisms of smaller groups, of smaller nationalities in Eastern Europe, tended to kind of create a destabilizing force in those empires in Eastern Europe, in the Russian Empire, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and in the Ottoman Empire. They created a kind of instability as these empires tried to grapple with the fact that they had these various cultural groupings that weren't satisfied with mere autonomy, but wanted nation states of their own, and in fact were breaking away, in some cases, in a series of small wars from these different empires. And the empires, of course, were reacting, sometimes trying to put them down, sometimes these rebellions down, sometimes acceding to them. It just depended. But it was creating a great deal of instability in the political order, the geopolitical order of Europe that had existed since the fall of Napoleon in 1815. German nationalism, of course, represented another threat, another threat to the stability of Europe, because what happened was, Europe, since the fall of Napoleon in 1815 and the creation of sort of the grand European order of the 19th century, had consisted of a number of great powers that were kind of all in balance with each other. You had France, you had Great Britain, you had Russia, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and sort of what they called the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire as well. The rise of Germany destabilized this, because suddenly in the very heart of Europe, you had the rise of an entirely new great power. And this great power felt that it had a right to its place in the sun. It wanted to have a greater influence over European affairs, and it felt it had this due because of its great population and the fact that it was a rising industrial power. By the end of the 19th century, Germany would surpass the United Kingdom to become the greatest industrial power in Europe, a position, a status that it holds even to this day. within the European Union and within Europe generally. So this growing instability in Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries created a sense of insecurity among the great powers of Europe and the lesser powers of Europe as well. And one of the ways that the various powers of Europe tried to responded or reacted to this instability, this growing unease within Europe about the balance of power, was by creating alliances. And this chart shows you just how complex these alliances were. And I don't want to. That's what I said when I talk about the incredible complexity of the factors that led up to World War I. Part of it was these overlapping, intricate set of alliances that the different powers of Europe formed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Treaties, mutual defense treaties, treaties between the various powers that said, if you're attacked, I'll defend you, but only under certain conditions. And some of these treaties were out in the open. Everybody knew what they were. And some of them were negotiated in secret, so nobody exactly knew who was allied to who or what, or if they were allied to each other, what that alliance really meant. Did it mean that they were just going to, sort of provide material aid to their ally? Were they going to actually go to war with their ally? And who were they going to attack? Which one of their allies' enemies would they attack? It was all extremely complicated, and of course, as I said, making it even more complex and even more difficult to follow, and even more destabilizing and treacherous in a way, was the fact that some of these treaties were signed in total secret, so nobody knew exactly who was aligned with who. So, if war was to break out between any two powers, nobody knew exactly who was going to get involved in this war. The other reaction, the other response to the growing instability of within Europe and the pursuit that the great powers of Europe were following to try to secure themselves, was an arms race. And you can see from this chart just how expensive and extensive this arms race had become. Just looking at the 5 years prior to the outbreak of war in 1914, between 1908 and 1913, or actually 6 years here, you can see that almost all the great powers of Europe had vastly expanded their war-making ability and their pursuit of greater and greater armaments. And it wasn't just the money they were spending, is that these armaments were becoming increasingly modernized and sophisticated. And so you can see, for example, Germany, its military budget goes from $286.7 million to $463 million in a matter of 6 years. That's almost a doubling. And by the way, these are all inflation-adjusted dollars. And by the way, returning to this idea of alliance, while very complex, you can kind of divide it down into two basic groupings of power. You had what were called the Triple Entente, which was formed by the United Kingdom, France, and Russia, and their smaller allies on one side in the years in 1914, just as World War I's going. And the Central Powers, the three great powers that were in opposition to the Triple Entente, and that would be Germany, Austro-Hungary, and you can barely see it down in the right-hand corner. It's called Turkey, but it's actually really the Ottoman Empire. And they are the powers in pink. The Triple Entente is the three powers in sort of the orange or yellowish-orange color. And the Triple Entente is also known, of course, as in World War I, it became known as the Allies. Now, what we've looked at very briefly and in a quite simplified way, the various long-term forces that led to World War I, there was a triggering event. And the triggering event was the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife in June of 1914 in the city of Sarajevo. The Archduke Ferdinand was actually the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, the Austro-Hungarian imperial throne, and he was murdered by a fanatical group of Serbian nationalists. Sarajevo, of course, was then and still is the principal city in Bosnia, and again, we don't want to get into all the complexities, but Bosnia has a significant portion of its people that are of Serbian cultural background. Serbia felt that Bosnia should be part of Greater Serbia, the independent country of Serbia, as part of this sort of nationalism, Serbian nationalism. Austro-Hungarian Empire had absorbed Bosnia some years earlier, and this assassination was meant to undermine Austro-Hungarian control of Bosnia and allow Serbia. The hope was it would trigger an event that would allow Serbia to gain Bosnia as part of Greater Serbia. If anybody's ever studied the Balkan Wars of the 1990s in the aftermath of the fall of Yugoslavia and the fall of communism, you can see a lot of parallels here. The Serbian nationalism in the war of in the Balkan Wars of the 1990s was also a factor. But in the years leading up to World War I, what happened was, of course, was when the Archduke was murdered, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, needless to say, demanded satisfaction, demanded that Serbia turn over the people responsible for the assassination. There was this, sort of secretive ultra-nationalist group within Serbia. They were called the Black Hand, who believed in acts of anarchist violence, including assassinating political leaders like the Archduke Ferdinand. Austria demanded that Serbia turn them over. Serbia said we have no that, and Austria declared that these nationalists were part of the Serbian government. Serbian government denied that. Austria then said, well, if you don't turn them over, we are going to invade Serbia. Serbia then immediately turns to its ally, Russia, for support. Russia, of course, is allied with Serbia because they're both Slavic people. They speak similar Slavic languages. They're both of the Eastern Orthodox Church. They share certain, their nationalities have certain overlaps culturally, and so the Russians come to the defense of Serbia. At that point, all that secretive and open alliances and mutual defense treaties and all this sort of thing begins to come into play. And over the course of the summer of 1914, between the assassination in late June of the Archduke and the outbreak of war in August of 1914, all of these alliances begin to start moving their armies into place. As Germany backs Austria, then Russia, as I said, Russia declares, backs Serbia. Germany then backs Austro-Hungary, and in response to that, against Russia, France then says it declares war on Russia, and in the process, this alliance between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany, they bring in their ally, the Ottoman Empire. France brings in its ally, Great Britain. And so by August of 1914, you have these two great collections of alliances, the Triple Entente and the Central Powers, facing off against each other. In looking back on World War I, many historians sort of describe it as sort of this catastrophe that kind of didn't need to happen. That part of the problem was just really stupid leadership, that people kind of just walked into this war, that these alliances kind of fell into place. And one of the reasons why they sort of walked into war was that many of the powers in Europe, many of the European leaders and the populations of these various countries thought that the war would be easy, quick. After all, the only other major European war, the war in the main part of Europe in the 19th century, had been a very brief but decisive war between Prussia and France in 1870 and 71. They'd been over in a matter of months. Most people thought that the war would end like that, quickly and decisively. And as you can see from these pictures, both the British and Germans and the other great allied forces in Europe in the summer of 1914, marched off to war expecting it to be glorious. It was a way to sort of, Europe hadn't been at war in literally, there hadn't been a general European war in 100 years since the fall of Napoleon in 1815. Again, people thought it would be over quickly. They thought it was going to be a glorious effort. It would allow, young men to prove their manhood. And you can see from these pictures that both sort of march off expecting a quick war, a decisive war, and the saying at the time, both on both sides of the looming conflict was, well, we'll be home by Christmas and we'll be victorious, and we'll have, each of us will be able to cover ourselves in a mantle of bravery. But what none of the powers, none of the leaders, and none of the populations, for the most part, of these different sides in the conflict reckoned with the technological developments that had occurred in the 100 years since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And part of this which is not illustrated here. I'll get to the what we see in this picture in a moment. But part of it had to do with the fact that, Europe had massively industrialized over the course of the 19th century. The populations of the various powers of Europe had grown dramatically. The countries had become much richer and more powerful. The nation states, the governments had become more powerful. They were able to mobilize far greater elements of the population, so the armies were much, much bigger, and the industrial capacity to produce the weapons and material of war had grown immeasurably. And so what World War I developed into was a kind of total warfare in which the entire society was harnessed to develop the armaments and weapons of war, where the new powers of bureaucracy and the government were able to recruit millions and millions of soldiers and kind of keep them organized and direct them to where they were needed to be fought, and to create the supply networks that would bring them the weaponry and materials they needed. So there was that sort of background, and then more immediately were the new weaponry of war. And you can see some of them right here. You can see sort of the three really crucial ones or the two really couple of crucial ones were, one was the machine gun, and of course ultimately chemical weapons that began to be utilized in World War I, and barbed wire, surprisingly, which had been developed in the 19th century in America and then was transferred to Europe. And of course, barbed wire was initially used on the Great Plains of Europe to kind of keep livestock in check. But in World War I, it was deployed on the battlefield. And what these different kinds of these critical weapons, particularly machine guns and barbed wire, was they gave a great advantage to the defense as opposed to the offense. In other words, by using barbed wire across the battlefield, you could slow down the enemy's assault and offensive in time to bring forward the incredible deadly arms of modern machine guns, which could just mow down troops. And so in response to what happened was, because it was so deadly to be on the battlefield in the face of these new weapons, each side sort of dug in, forming massive complexes of trenches where they could largely be safe from the deadly, where once you're in the trench, you would be safe from the deadly effects of this modern warfare above ground. But the moment you emerge to kind of take the offensive, you'd be mowed down. Later in the war, both sides would develop weaponry to kind of counteract trench warfare and to counteract barbed wire and the impact of machine guns. Airplanes were deployed to sort of, not so much to attack the enemy, but to develop reconnaissance so you could see where the enemy was and what he was up to. Airplanes as a major form of offensive weaponry would not really emerge until the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, and then more effectively in World War II. The tank was even more effective because it allowed infantrymen to sort of move forward in their wake and kind of able to advance more effectively. But even with these new weapons, defensive warfare was much more, had the upper hand. And many, and in the first few years of the war, actually throughout the war, the generals on each side sort of hadn't recognized the new dynamics of war. And so they would send over masses of troops like they had used in previous wars to defeat the enemy. But in this case, in World War I, what this meant was mass slaughter. So you would have these battles that would take place in which hundreds of thousands of soldiers would be wounded and killed in a matter of weeks, in weeks of slaughter. So with the slaughter and unable to move forward, the warfare of World War I, particularly on the Western Front, there was also an Eastern Front with Russia, but even there it was the case as well, began to settle down into this kind of barely moving fronts where there would be these massive offensives, and you can see some of the list of battles shown here, or fortified towns shown here. You can sort of see the front line, where a great offensive would occur on the part of either the Allies or the Central Powers, and it would usually result in, after the deaths of hundreds of thousands of soldiers over many months, the front line would move merely a matter of miles. So it was kind of a stalemate in Europe, a bloody, destructive, awful stalemate that went on for year after year. Here, for example, is the First Battle of the Somme. And note the fact that it's the first battle of the Somme. There were actually 3 battles of the Somme, all fought over the same few miles of territory. The Somme is a river in Belgium, which was between the 2 front lines. And you can just see, for example, in the first battle of the Somme between July and November of 1916, there were 1.1 million casualties in that war, in that particular battle. So you can see the enormous destructiveness and horrors of World War One. And of course, adding to it was the use of chemical weapons, which were these new and very frightening forms of weaponry that would poison the enemy's troops by sending over clouds of poison gas. But the machine gun, new forms of artillery, just meant that the battlefield was the battles were these enormous killing fields. Where hundreds of thousands of men would be killed to advance maybe the front, maybe a few miles. So now let's get back to America. What was America's view of this? For most part, America's view of this was horror, just absolute horror at what was happening. Remember, America was filled with millions of immigrants who came from these countries. Many of them knew people that were dying in the war, and American attitudes can kind of be captured in this cartoon. This cartoon actually comes from shortly after the war, but it sort of shows American attitudes that all of the European powers are to blame, that each pointed to the other as causing this horrible Holocaust, really, this wartime, this destructive war beyond anything that had ever been registered in the history of mankind before. And there was this attitude that basically, the Europeans, it played into American stereotypes about Europeans as treacherous, as dangerous, as warmongering, as secretive, all those alliances that had kind of caused this war, the secret treaties, sort of the manipulation of geopolitics for the gain of each country. And so American attitudes were basically, we should stay out of this horrible conflict. And so in the middle of the war, of course, the United States, the American people go to the polls, right? There's an election, a presidential election in 1916. And Woodrow Wilson, who's president of the United States in 1912, was first elected in 1912, and he's running for re-election. Basically, he runs a major part of his campaign is a peace campaign, right? Basically saying, as you can see from these political buttons, he has kept us out of the war. Vote for him and he will keep us out of the war. The only problem was that it was very difficult for America to stay out of the war. America was a major trading nation. We had a major armaments industry. We were supplying armaments to the belligerents, particularly to the Allies, to France and the United Kingdom in their war against the Central Powers of Germany, Austro-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. So we were involved in the war in a way indirectly by supplying these armaments. And what had happened was that to counteract this, Germany realized that it had to find a way to kind of stop these armaments, these American armaments, from flowing, these American material from flowing to France and England, to their enemies. And so it began a strategy of submarine warfare in the Atlantic. And this had started shortly after World War I broke out. And they were sinking ships that had both American supplies on it as well as American passengers. One of the worst incidents of torpedoing was that of the Lusitania, a massive passenger ship sunk in the Irish Sea just off the coast of England, in which hundreds of Americans were aboard and died when the boat sank. Germans claimed that the ship was carrying armaments. The United States denied that. Britain denied that. In fact, it was true. It was carrying armaments. But part of the problem was that, submarine warfare was a different kind of warfare. It was a kind of warfare that kind of shocked people at the time because previously, in wars at sea, merchant ships were targets at wars at sea, right? You always wanted to cut off your enemy's ability to supply itself from overseas. And so merchant ships were always a target. Even passenger ships were always a target. But in previous forms of warfare, you had other warships that would come in and they would stop these passenger ships or these freighters or these merchant ships at sea. They would fire warning shots. They would then board the ships, inspect them. They could even pull them back into enemy ports if they wanted to. But submarines couldn't do that. If a submarine were to surface and try to seize a ship, most merchant ships had weapons on board. to protect them that would sink that submarine. Submarines were a very fragile, small craft, and so the only way a submarine could effectively deal with stopping a merchant ship or stopping a passenger ship or stopping even a warship was to sink it without any warning, right? To fire torpedoes from under the water that would sink the ship. And submarines, of course, could not save the passengers because they were tiny little vessels. They couldn't bring the passengers onto the ships. So it was basically a form of unannounced attack, a secretive attack on what were perceived as merchant and passenger ships that would cause great loss of life. And it was seen as very treacherous and nasty and violating sort of rules of warfare and rules of humanity. So it was seen in World War I, in the early years of World War I, as a particularly treacherous form of warfare. Ultimately, Germany backs off the submarine warfare by 1915 after this Lusitania incident because they fear they don't want to bring the United States into the war on the side of the Allies, on the side of France and England. But there were other factors bringing goading the United States into war. One, of course, was the efforts by the Allies, by Britain and France, and particularly Britain, because Britain was an English-speaking country. It saw itself as having a special relationship with the United States, were efforts by the British to draw in the Americans. And so there was a lot of propaganda that the British sent towards America to try to convince them that the Germans were evil and dangerous and represented a threat ultimately to America itself, ultimately to civilization itself, as this poster sort of depicts. Germany is this bloodthirsty monster with a pirate insignia on the helmet of this German commander. That they had to be stopped, and that America had to join with other democracies like France and England to stop this authoritarian state called Germany from gaining its will and gaining dominance within Europe, and ultimately threatening the United States itself. But for the most part, this propaganda, Americans took it in stride. They agreed. They sided with, in spirit, they were with the Allies. They saw France and England, of course, as a natural sort of cultural ally. They saw England and France both as democracies. France, of course, had been our ally in the revolution and helped us achieve independence, so there was a great deal of sympathy towards France, but it didn't reach the level that Americans said, yeah, we want to get involved in this bloody, horrible conflict. But then there was another incident that was quite critical, and that was something called the Zimmermann telegram, and I show it here. So the Zimmermann telegram was this incident in which in early 1917, the foreign minister of Germany, a guy named Zimmermann, sent a coded telegram. You can see it here on the left. Just the numbers indicating this is sort of the code that the Germans used. And basically it was a message to the German ambassador in Mexico City. Mexico, of course, was neutral in the war. It hadn't taken sides yet. And the telegram basically stated that if Mexico would join Germany in the struggle against the Allies, including what Germany saw as a kind of a unofficial ally of France and England, that is the United States, which was supplying them with arms and materiel for the war, that Germany would if Germany won the war with Mexico's help, they would help Mexico regain the territory it had lost in the Mexican-American War. Now, the Germans sent this as a coded telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico City, who then took this offer to the president of Mexico at the time. And of course, Mexico and the United States had been sort of this low-level conflict concerning the Mexican Revolution in these years. There had been back-and-forth raids between the two countries as Mexico descended into this revolutionary ferment. But the problem was, for the Germans, was that they didn't realize that the British had broken their code. And so the British, of course, immediately find out about this telegram. They intercept it, they decode it, and it is, gold for them. And so they immediately send it to American newspapers, where it gets published in its deciphered form, which you can see here on the right. And they're basically telling the Americans what the Germans are up to. And of course, Americans are absolutely outraged by this. The whole thing is really kind of preposterous, because the idea that the Mexican government is going to be able to that Mexico was going to reclaim and gain back the territories it lost in the Mexican-American War, of course, was completely preposterous. And the German ambassador's overture to the president of Mexico was dealt with in a way exactly how you think it would be. The president of Mexico said, "Thank you very much. I appreciate what you're saying, but no, we're not going to get involved in this." So the whole thing was kind of ridiculous, but it really got Americans angry at what Germany was up to, and seeing Germany as a threat, even though it was really kind of preposterous. But again, it stirred up American patriotism and nationalism and American defensiveness. But more important to the gathering clouds of warfare over the United States was this: that in 1917, Germany had come to the realization, the war was grinding on year after year. Germany was suffering. Its people were suffering immensely. Not only were soldiers dying, but Germany was suffering from a lack of supplies, a lack of materiel. It couldn't get resupplied by the United States because the United States wasn't trading with Germany. So, in the face of this fact that Germany was basically, the German people were actually going, hungry. There were food lines and all this sort of thing in the midst of war. Germany decided to take a gamble. They felt that they needed to cut off British and French supplies and force the French and British to negotiate a peace deal that would be beneficial to Germany. And so it took a gamble. It decided to launch unconditional, widespread submarine warfare against Allied shipping in the Atlantic, including American shipping. And here you can see in this chart, in the following chart, just what happened. So you can see in early 1917, German U-boat activity. U-boat means Unterboot in German, means undersea boat, Unterseeboot, the German word for submarine. And you can see the huge number of ships that are sunk by the German submarine wing of the German Navy here in early 1917. And of course, many of these ships, some of these ships, most of the ships were British, but some of the ships were actually American, and that would be the neutral, the blue at the bottom there. Of course, after the war, after America enters the war, American ships become, other Allied merchantmen becomes the black bar. But you can see just how great the number of ships. Here's the tonnage is on the left, and of course hundreds and hundreds of American sailors and merchantmen and even passengers aboard these ships were dying in submarine warfare, which I mentioned earlier, was seen as this very treacherous form of warfare in those years. Facing all of these sort of threats, particularly the submarine warfare, Woodrow Wilson has a change of heart and decides that there's increasing growing pressure by the American population that we need to address German aggression, address sort of some of the issues raised by the Zimmerman telegram, and particularly the submarine, the uncontrolled submarine warfare that the Germans were engaging in. And so on April 2nd, 1917, just less than 4 weeks after being inaugurated into the presidency for the second time, Woodrow Wilson goes back on his campaign promise and declares war against the Central Powers of Europe, and America enters the war. One of the other key events of 1917 regarding World War I was, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution. So in October of 1917, the Bolsheviks, or communists in Russia, launched a successful revolution against the government of Russia. And their motto is peace, land, and bread. Their big pitch to the Russian people is that we will get you out of World War I. And many Russians were very eager to get out of World War I because of all the great powers, even more than Germany. The Russian people were truly suffering from the effects of World War I. People were going hungry. Thousands of people had dying. The Russian army and the Russian government were not capable of kind of engaging in this kind of modern armored warfare. Many of the troops were not adequately armed and were dying in the face of superior German weaponry, and it was just all around quite awful for the Russian people. And so they were many of them were sick of the war and wanted to get out of it. And so when the Bolsheviks promised this, many people rallied to their flag. There were other issues as well. The land issue, that farmland that was controlled mostly by rich aristocratic landowners would be distributed to the peasants, and that the Russian government would actively go about making sure that everybody was properly fed by seizing the property of the wealthy and distributing it to the people. That the nation's production capacity, its factories, its workshops would be turned over to the workers in the form of worker Soviets. Soviets is a Russian word for council. So these worker councils would take over the means of production in Europe. And Russia and the Bolsheviks do live up to some of their promises, particularly in the form of peace. They immediately sue for peace with Germany and sign what's known as the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, in which basically Russia agrees to a peace with Germany, but since Germany has the upper hand because Russia is desperate for peace at this point, Russia loses a lot of its territory to the Germans. But the Bolsheviks feel that sacrifice is worth it because it will allow them to give the Russian people what they want. It'll allow them to consolidate their hold on power. In fact, what happens in the wake of the Russian Revolution is a civil war as counter-revolutionaries rise up with the help of allies, and we'll talk about this a little later in the class, in this lecture, rise up to destroy the Russian Revolution. They're not successful. The Russian Revolution takes hold, of course, and Russia is turned into a communist state known as the Soviet Union, which will last until its collapse in 1991 with the end of the Cold War. Now, of course, the loss of Russia as a major ally and the loss of the fact that the Germans no longer had to defend themselves on the Eastern Front and can send all of their troops and materiel to the Western Front against England and France would have been a decisive blow against English and French interests, and probably would have led ultimately to them signing an armistice or peace with the Germans on terms that the Germans would have had the advantage, but the big difference now was, of course, that suddenly there was a new ally in the war. And not just any ally. There was an ally that had an immense population, an ally with an industrial capacity greater than all the countries of any country in Europe. And in fact, the United States had a greater industrial capacity than both England and France put together. So suddenly the United States has both this country with an immense population, the potential for a huge army to be sent over to Europe, and it also, of course, has this incredible industrial capacity to make the armaments and material of warfare now available to the Allies. Now, it does take some time for Americans to sort of gear up for war, to mobilize for war, to turn civilian production into military production, and of course simply the physical act of getting these millions of U.S. troops over across the Atlantic to Europe. But they do achieve it, and by the summer and fall of 1918, a year and a half after America enters the war, it is quite clear that it is making a decisive difference. And so by the autumn of 1918, Germany is on its last legs, and you can see some of the effects here. There are food shortages, there are material shortages in German cities, and the German people are really suffering. And of course, it leads to great unrest in Germany. There's right after the war, there would be a failed communist revolution in response to the awful conditions Germany was facing. The communist revolution would ultimately be put down, and Germany would adopt a republican form of government. But the point here is that Germany was on its last legs by the fall of 1918, and the United States' entry into World War I was the decisive factor. And part of that, as we said, part of that factor that led to America's being, part of the reason why the Americans were decisive was our enormous industrial capacity. And what you saw in World War I, of course, was that the mobilization for war created a kind of a revolution in American society. For one thing, it brought hundreds of thousands of women into the manufacturing workforce in a way that they had never been in it before. And this, of course, helped convince many Americans that women's participation in the conflict helped convince Americans that women deserved the right to vote, which they won shortly after the war was over. The war, awful as it was, over 100,000 Americans were killed in the war, so you don't want to make too much light of how awful it was for many Americans and many American families. It did have beneficial effects for other groups of Americans. For example, the desperate need for defense plant workers in the North meant that hundreds of thousands of jobs, good paying defense jobs, opened up that there just weren't the manpower to fill or woman power to fill. And many African Americans in the South took advantage of this. This began the great migration of African Americans out of the South that would continue into the 1960s as hundreds of thousands of African Americans, millions of African Americans, fled the segregation and poverty of the South, of sharecropping in the South, of the racism of the South, moving north to cities and moving west to, of course, to places in California as well, to find jobs in better paying factory jobs that were suddenly available to them as they had never been before. Now, of course, coming north didn't mean that African Americans entirely escaped the racism of American society. Northern cities had their own form of racism. It wasn't de jure racism, it wasn't legal racism, it wasn't legal segregation. That didn't really exist in the North. But it was still prevalent, a kind of de facto segregation and racism throughout the North. And what happens as these hundreds of thousands of African Americans pour into northern and midwestern and western cities, you get a reaction from the white population, a violent reaction, and a series of riots, particularly right after World War I, against African Americans, sort of moving into neighborhoods that whites considered to be their own. And there were race riots in places like East St. Louis and Chicago that involved, that resulted in the deaths of dozens upon dozens of African Americans as whites would sweep into their neighborhoods, attacking stores and shops and other parts of African American neighborhoods. The cities were highly segregated. For example, the riots that gripped Chicago for several days in the summer of 1919 were triggered when a couple of young teenage black kids decided to. They were on a beach. Chicago, of course, is on Lake Michigan, and there are a number of beaches that people go to swim, to get relief from the summer heat. And a couple of these black teenagers had wandered onto a white beach and were swimming in what waters that were considered to be for white swimmers only, and whites had reacted, and it led to this massive rioting and violence against the black community of Chicago right after the war. And also during the war. But moving into the international stage, moving back to the international stage from the home front, in the wake of the war, and the armistice is signed, that is a kind of a temporary peace is signed in November of 1918. It goes into effect at 11 minutes after 11 a.m. On November 11th, 1918. The significance of that number, the symbolism of that number, was the idea that, if you've ever heard the expression, you're in the 11th hour, you're in the final hour before a disaster is going to strike, and you better prepare for that, was the idea that, civilization itself was in its 11th hour, that if it didn't find a way, if Europe did not find a way to resolve its disputes and differences peacefully, terrible wars like the Great War were going to break out again. So that was the symbolism of sort of ending the war at 11 minutes after 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month, November of 1918. So in the wake of the war, Woodrow Wilson travels to Europe. They set up, there's going to be a big peace conference in Paris in 1919. It actually takes place at Versailles, the great palace of King Louis XVI, King Louis XIV, out in the suburbs of Paris. And Wilson arrives there with an agenda of his own, an agenda informed by the progressive ideals that he had. Right, he was very much a progressive era leader, and he felt that there must be a better way to resolve international disputes. And so he goes there with the idea that why not create this a system, a peace system, a system that would defend democracy around the world. And so he meets at Versailles with the other Allied leaders. The Germans were not invited. The enemy was not invited. So it was only the Allied leaders that were allowed to participate in the conference at Versailles. And there, Woodrow Wilson presents what he calls his 14 points. And as you can see from this picture, before I get to the 14 points, you can see he is greeted as a great hero. Here he is arriving in Paris in 1919 for the conference, and you can see the big banner and reading "Long Live Wilson," and all the people lining up to greet the person that the great leader of America, who they felt had saved France and had saved the Allies from a German victory. So Wilson arrives with this progressive agenda, and the progressive agenda, in international terms, was a way to prevent warfare, and so you can see, and he comes with what he calls his 14 points, and if we look at his 14 points, basically, he wanted to get rid of all that secretive treaty making and alliances that had led to World War I. So open covenants of peace, openly arrived at, he argues for. He talks about freedom of navigation upon the seas, so there would be no more submarine warfare. All economic barriers and establishment of the equality of trading conditions, that nations could trade freely with each other. They wouldn't put up tariffs against each other. He talked about reducing armaments to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety, so countries would not have the capacity to make war with armaments. All very rational, all very logical, all very progressive. A free, open-minded, absolutely impartial adjustment of colonial claims. I want to get to that in a minute. Territorial claims adjusted so that various nationalities could have nation states of their own. Now, what Wilson was very much a product of his time, a deeply racist man. It's something we need to kind of keep in mind. He's the man who praised the film Birth of a Nation and thought it showed the glorious victory of the white Ku Klux Klan against African Americans during Reconstruction. He was a deeply racist man, and when he talked about adjusting colonial claims, he was not really talking about allowing freedom for the brown and black-skinned peoples of the world from European colonialism. What he was talking about was freeing the various nationalities of Europe from the imperial claims of places like Austro-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire and so forth. And finally, his 14th point was really the what he considered to be the linchpin of his plan, and that was an association of nations, what would become known as the League of Nations, that would be guarantee mutual, that would all work together as a world community, kind of world government, that would guarantee the political independence of every nation on earth, the territorial integrity of every great and small states alike, as it says here, and would also create an institution in which disputes among nations could be resolved peacefully under the aegis of kind of an international sort of court of law that all the nations of the world would participate in. Again, a very progressive, democratic sort of idea for achieving world peace and ending war. Wilson talked about, let's make World War I the war to end all wars. So there must be something good that will come out of it. But in fact, for all of the praise and adulation that Wilson received in Europe at the Versailles Conference, basically the Allies, Britain and France, pretty much ignored him. The leaders of Britain and France had their own political issues to deal with. They had their own domestic politics that they had to answer to. And particularly in France, there was the attitude that Germans should pay for what they had done. Remember, much of the war had been fought on French soil. It had caused great devastation to the French nation economically and in terms of actual human life. I mean, France suffered probably more from the war than almost every country in Europe, other than perhaps Russia. Roughly 1/4 of its fighting age male population was killed or wounded in the war. 1/4, an enormous number. And basically France wanted Germany to pay. England sided with its French allies. They also felt that Germany needed to be kept down. And so the peace treaty that emerged out of Versailles was a very vindictive one against Germany. It basically blamed Germany for the war completely. It forced Germany to pay huge reparations to the Allies, huge monetary reparations and payments in kind to the French and English and other nations that had suffered from the German army and German occupation. And as we're going to see when we talk about what leads up to World War II, many Germans felt that it was a unfair punishment and resented it very much, including a young corporal in the German army during World War I, a guy named Adolf Hitler, who utilized the grievances of the German people around what they considered to be an overly vindictive peace. The Germans felt that they alone had not started World War I. They were not entirely to blame, but they were being blamed, and they were forced to pay all these reparations, crippling the German economy, and there was a lot of resentment. But we'll talk about that a little bit later when we get to the onset of World War II. Meanwhile, returning to the United States. So after achieving this peace treaty in Versailles and getting European powers to agree to the League of Nations, even though he can't agree to let them to have them create a peace treaty that's a little less vindictive towards Germany. He still gets them to agree to the League of Nations, and he comes home, and he decides, and he is presented with the task of explaining the League of Nations to the United States. Now, as we talked about earlier this week, when we talked about sort of America's reluctance to get involved in world affairs, we had mentioned the fact that throughout American history, really until after World War II, America had never joined any kind of defensive alliance or any kind of alliance with other nations outside of actually World War One, and never during peacetime. And so what Wilson was asking the United States to do, in effect, by joining the League of Nations, was, in a sense, sort of signing up for this world body that would make decisions that would involve the United States, over which the United States government did not really have control. Yes, we'd have a representative there. Yes, that representative would vote yea or nay to agree to U.S. participation in whatever activities the League of Nations had got itself involved in, particularly activities involving questions of war and peace and defending certain countries. But to many Americans, this was a global alliance that would tie the United States down, that would force it to join with other nations, even if it didn't want to, in a sense, and that would require it to get involved in conflicts that it didn't want to get into, based on the decisions made by other countries. Under the U.S. Constitution, of course, it would be the U.S. Senate that would have to sign off on this treaty to join the League of Nations. And there was a lot of opposition into the Senate, a lot of isolationist opposition. In other words, a lot of, not so much isolationist, I should say anti-League of Nations politics that were going on. One of the leading opponents of American involvement in the League of Nations, American intervention, or excuse me, American membership in the League of Nations, was Senator William Borah of Idaho. In fact, the main regions of the country that were opposed to American involvement in the League of Nations were primarily the Midwestern and Western states. And in this speech that he gives on November 19th, 1919, roughly a year after the war had ended, and right after Wilson had signed the Treaty of Versailles and committed the United States to membership in the League, he writes, "Our accredited representatives will be members of the Assembly. They will sit there to represent the judgment of these 110 million people," that is the Americans, "just as we are accredited here to represent our constituencies. We cannot send our representatives to sit in council with the representatives of other nations of the world, with mental reservations as to what we shall do in case their judgment shall not be satisfactory to us." In other words, if the League of Nations decides to get involved in some conflict around the world in which troops are involved to kind of create a bulwark for peace, in other words, to try to keep belligerents apart from each other in a war or something, then the United States would be committed to this policy. And he asked the question to the president, kind of a rhetorical question: "Shall we go there, Mr. President, to sit in judgment? In case that judgment works for peace, join with our allies, but in case it works for war, withdraw our cooperation?" In other words, if the League of Nations decides to get involved in a war to prevent sort of a war, in other words, to send troops to maintain, to kind of bring a conflict to a conclusion, and we don't agree with that, he's basically saying, we can't agree to certain decisions of the League of Nations and not agree to others. We'll be tied down. We'll have to do this. And our sovereignty, our ability to control the fate and destiny of our own country and our own people will be taken away from us. And here he writes, "But now we are transferring to one man the stupendous power of representing the sentiment and convictions of 110 million people in tremendous questions which may involve the peace or may involve the war of the world. We are in the midst of all the affairs of Europe. We have entangled ourselves with all European concerns. We have joined in alliance with all the European nations, which have thus far joined the League. We are sitting there dabbling in their affairs and intermeddling their concerns." Again, going back to that idea that Americans should stay out of European affairs. And here we were being, we've been drawn into World War I, and what had happened? There had been a peace treaty. Yes, we had won the war, but the peace treaty wasn't on our terms. The Europeans had gone back to their old ways of punishing others, of trying to project power politics. They were trying to, the English and the French were up to their typical games of trying to, project themselves as the great powers of Europe and keep Germany down? And why should the United States be involved in this intramural fighting that the Europeans were involved in, these power politics that we had no business to get involved in? It doesn't serve our interests, and we should stay out. And it comes to this question, which is fundamental with me, he says he's addressing the president. We have forfeited and surrendered once and for all the great policy of no entangling alliances upon which the strength of this republic has been founded for 150 years. Wilson tries to counteract this by going around the Senate, and he goes on this whistle-stop tour, this train tour of the United States, trying to stir up public sentiment in favor of the League of Nations. But the population is just not that into the idea of America joining the League of Nations. And Wilson goes on this tour. This breakneck, exhausting tour. He's not a young man at this point. He suffers a terrible stroke, which basically incapacitates him for the rest of his presidency. Just a little aside here. We're in 2016, America, almost 100 years after Wilson was reelected, we almost elected our first female president. But some historians have argued that we already had a female president in the form of Edith Wilson, because when President Wilson was totally incapacitated by stroke during his whirlwind tour of the United States during the last year and a half of his presidency, that basically was kept largely a secret from the American people, something that was possible sort of in this early age of mass media, when the president could live in more anonymity or exist in more of a bubble than he can today. And that, in fact, behind the scenes, Edith Wilson was really running the government, and so, in effect, was de facto the first female president of the United States. Anyways, that's just an aside here. So, the United States, of course, ultimately, with Wilson incapacitated and the American populace kind of eager to sort of end its involvement in European affairs and sort of turn inward again, the treaty is defeated, and Wilson loses his plans to get the United States into the League of Nations. Meanwhile, in that 1919, one of the factors that's leading towards American attitudes about sort of becoming more isolationist again, not getting, sort of staying out of European America, was a general sense that America had big problems at home. And one of the big problems it had at home in 1919 was a series of massive strikes that broke out as the American economy tried to sort of gear itself away from war production to peacetime production. There were a lot of disruptions in the economy that produced high levels of inflation, and this set off a wave of massive strikes throughout the American economy, including, most shockingly for many Americans, a police strike in Boston, in which the police basically walked off the job, to demand higher pay. This wave of strikes sort of terrified many middle class and sort of more moderate and conservative Americans that America was descending into chaos with these massive strikes. There were strikes in the coal mine industry, the steel industry, the railroad industry. Millions of workers were going on strike, and there's sort of sense of anarchism descending on the United States, that the United States should focus inward. In addition to that, there was also a great fear of what was happening overseas, particularly in terms of the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution, of course, was a communist revolution. Many Americans were deeply opposed to communism, and they basically felt that American involvement in the world would only lead to the infiltration of dangerous, radical communist ideas into America itself. You can see in this cartoon, you can see the idea of liberalism. You can also read it as progressivism and progressive era ideas of government involved, more government regulation of the economy, government activism, all the sort of programs we talked about earlier when we were talking about the progressive era, that the snake of Bolshevism carried the apple of liberalism. And so in a sense, one of the factors that led to the demise of the progressive consensus in America was this sort of this idea that progressivism would only lead to communism and radical, dangerous ideas. And conservative politicians who were opposed to progressivism used this argument quite effectively in sort of pushing back against progressivism, and they used the threat of communism. But the threat of communism also kind of led Americans to feel like, we need to stay out of international affairs. They're laced with all kinds of dangerous ideas, and the more we can stay away from things like Bolshevism or communism in Russia, the better off we'll be. Now, of course, there were many people there were also large numbers of people in the United States, radicals, who were somewhat sympathetic to Bolshevism and felt that communism offered a better way than capitalism. And they, particularly the Socialist Party, not so much the Communist Party, but the Socialist Party of America was quite potent and quite a major player on the political scene during World War I. And during World War I, of course, the American Socialist Party had opposed American entry into World War I, saying that World War I was really a capitalist warfare and it was only workers of one nation fighting against workers of another, and therefore American workers should oppose the war. Many of the socialists had been placed in jail and were labeled as subversives and anti-American during the war. And after the war, this sort of attitude about socialism continued in what was called the Red Scare. This fear that communism was taking over, and the American government went actively against any kind of radicals in the United States. There were a series of raids by the Attorney General's office, a guy named A. Mitchell Palmer, after his house had been bombed by radicals in Washington. And they, raided all kinds of political offices. The Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, were attacked because they were a socialist union. They had opposed American entry into World War I. And so there's this massive Red Scare, this fear of communism that led to all kinds of violations of civil liberties. Thousands upon thousands of immigrants who were involved in radical political parties and political movements were summarily deported back to were sent to the Soviet Union, to the communist Soviet Union, without any kind of without any hearings, without any chance to defend themselves in court. And in the wake of all of this radicalism and these attacks and this government oppression of any kind of radical or leftist political organizations and thought, you get the emergence of the American Civil Liberties Union, which was created in this era, in 1919-1920, to defend the civil liberties of Americans. And in 1920, of course, Americans go to the ballot box, as they do every 4 years, to elect a president and a Congress. And in the case of the 1920 election, they were faced with basically a choice. They could embrace a more conservative, pro-business, more isolationist approach to politics, or a more activist, a continuation of the progressive era. And in a massive landslide, the Republicans, favoring conservatism, pro-business values, and isolationist foreign policy, as I said, win in a massive victory, electing Warren G. Harding president and giving Republicans an overwhelming majority in both houses of Congress. And of course, Harding runs on this anti-progressive, anti-internationalist platform in which he declares America's present need is not heroics but healing. In other words, we don't need these progressive crusades anymore to make the world a better place, to make America a better place. We need to kind of go back to the basics, sort of building our economy, promoting business, staying out of world affairs. He says we need not nostrums, that is not fancy ideas to make the world better, but normalcy, not revolution, but restoration, not surgery, but serenity. This desire for what he called normalcy and a kind of a return to a more balanced way of life without all these progressive crusades, and also to stay out of world affairs, to remain isolated from the world, particularly isolated from Europe, because we don't want to get caught up in their power politics anymore, in their wars anymore. And we can see this reflected in the isolationism that grips the American people in the 1920s and 30s, captured here in these political cartoons by, of course, everybody's favorite children's book author, Dr. Seuss. And here he is talking about sort of stuff in the 1930s as the Nazis rise up and, sort of America sleeping away while all these awful things are happening in Europe. Of course, Dr. Seuss, as a progressive, as somebody who believed that America had a role in the world, and he was anti-fascist, anti-Hitler in a major way, believed that America was, sort of sleeping away while the rest of the world went into this awful situation of war and fascism and dangerous authoritarianism led by Hitler and the Nazis. And here he is, sort of shows the United States sleeping away, saying, "Oh, I'm so glad we have separate beds." But of course, Dr. Seuss is really saying we don't, obviously obviously a separate bed isn't enough. And then, of course, on the right, he's sort of talking about the America Firsters, those people who did not want to get involved in World War II, wanted America to remain isolated. And here he's sort of poking fun at them in a sarcastic sort of way, and having them read a children's tale called Adolf the Wolf. And the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones, but those were foreign children and it really didn't matter. In other words, Americans shouldn't get involved. Yes, Hitler's doing awful things, but it's not our business. We should stay out of European affairs. And we'll get to all of that in a couple of weeks when we get to World War II, what leads America into World War II. For now, we're going to turn next week to the domestic front again and take a look at America in the 1920s and the birth of the modern and what modernism means. And we'll take a look at that next week. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you on Monday.